Welcome to Totally Awesome Films, and in this episode we're going to talk about the 1986 film Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, otherwise known as The One with the Whales. With its lighthearted tone and themes of friendship, teamwork, and fun, its humorous jokes make it a delightful 2 hours of entertainment. It is arguably the greatest Star Trek movie and inarguably the top 2 greatest Star Trek films, possibly second only to Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. And it remained the highest grossing Star Trek film until 23 years later when it was dethroned by Star Trek 2009. It's an infinitely rewatchable classic that actually broke Star Trek out of its niche Trekkie roots and introduced the Enterprise crew to a whole new demographic that had never seen Star Trek before and helped launch a new golden age of Star Trek. Even before the release of Star Trek III, Paramount gave Leonard Nimoy the green light for a sequel. They were so pleased with Search for Spock that they lifted all constraints they put on him during that film and let him do anything he wanted for the 4th movie. They said, "Mr. Nimoy, give us your vision of Star Trek." The first story concept Leonard Nimoy and Harve Bennett toyed with was titled Star Trek IV, The Trial of Kirk. And this would be a continuation of Star Trek III, where the Klingons put Admiral Kirk on trial for the death of Krug and his crew. And while the whole concept was thrown away, we see small glimpses of it at the beginning of the film and in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. Nimoy and Bennett agreed to do a much lighter tone film without a clear-cut villain, since the last 2 films were very villain-heavy.
You guys like Italian?
No.
Yes.
Yes.
No.
No.
Yes.
No.
Yes. I love Italian. And so do you.
Yes.
Nimoy had a vision for the movie that was no dying, no fighting, no shooting, no photon torpedoes, no phaser blasts, no stereotypical bad guy. He just wanted the audience to have a great time while watching the film. They also wanted to do a time-traveling story. But during pre-production, William Shatner demanded too much money, and it looked like he might not be in the movie. Shatner had a very successful TV series called T.J. Hooker and had a little more leverage to negotiate. As a solution, Harve Bennett considered doing a prequel about the adventures of a young Kirk, Spock, and McCoy as cadets in Starfleet, and could use lesser-known actors. They would eventually do this for Star Trek 2009. Nimoy was not a fan of the idea of retiring the entire Star Trek cast for younger and cheaper actors, and this would cause tensions between Nimoy and Bennett. William Shatner and Paramount finally settled on a salary, and Shatner and Nimoy were both offered $2.5 million to return, and Shatner was given a clause in his contract that allowed him to direct the next film if he wanted to. And William Shatner would accept the offer, but that's another story. Leonard Nimoy was interested in ecology and of extinct animals since reading a book called Biophilia by Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson, and wanted to include an environmental message in his film. Nimoy and Bennett decided to do a time-traveling story that had a message about the ecology. It would be about something we take for granted today, but would be instrumental in saving the future. In the original treatment, a plague would be wiping out humanity, and it could only be cured by a small fish, the snail darter, that would exist in the rainforest of the past. In the future, the rainforest would have been completely destroyed. However, Nimoy and Bennett worried that the image of thousands of people dying by disease would be too depressing and would undermine the fun and humor of the movie. Leonard Nimoy worried that the Enterprise traveling all the way back in time in order to get a tiny fish might be a little underwhelming and anticlimactic for audiences. He came up with a perfect solution. Not a tiny fish, but something much larger, something gigantic. Well, how about a whale? Nimoy got the idea after talking to his friend about the mystery of the songs of humpback whales. He thought the idea of whales and their whale songs could add another layer of intrigue to the story. Well, now it's time to talk about someone who was almost in this movie, Eddie Murphy. Eddie Murphy was a huge Star Trek fan. Remember all those Star Trek references in his original stand-up act? Well, by pre-production of this movie, Eddie Murphy had become the new international phenomenon after 48 Hours and Trading Places, and then in 1984, he rose to superstar status with Beverly Hills Cop. Apparently, Eddie Murphy approached them and asked if he could be in the next Star Trek movie. And executive producer Jeff Katzenberg described it as either the best idea in the world or the worst. Nimoy and Bennett were intrigued and thought that his presence could widen Star Trek's audience. In the original screenplay by Steve Mearson and Patrick Crikes, Eddie Murphy was an eccentric English professor who was obsessed with whales and also believed in aliens. Eddie Murphy's character would help the Enterprise crew navigate the world of 1986 San Francisco and find their whales. His meeting up with the crew would not only have propelled the plot, but also provided much of the comic relief. When the Enterprise arrives in the 20th century and hear whale songs in the middle of San Francisco, this is because Eddie Murphy is playing whale songs to his college English class. Also, Eddie Murphy would have a male friend who was a marine biologist named Dr. Jillian Taylor, and a female friend who was a reporter. And there was a humorous scene where Eddie Murphy would get a hold of a phaser and would show it to his buddy, Jillian Taylor, or his reporter friend, as proof that aliens exist. Jillian, or the female reporter friend, would dismissively throw it on the ground and go to bed, and the cat would paw at the gun and accidentally shoot the furniture. Taylor would wake up in the morning to see much of his living room disintegrated. Murphy would seek out the Enterprise crew in Golden Gate Park and hit the invisible bird of prey and fall in the grass. And after getting Eddie Murphy's help, Admiral Kirk would thank him and beam up alone, but Murphy would grab Kirk's leg and beam up to the ship, and he would travel back with him to the 23rd century. However, Paramount worried about having Eddie Murphy in their Star Trek movie. There were risks of combining their two most lucrative franchises, Star Trek and Eddie Murphy. At worst, it could dilute both brands. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, Eddie Murphy hated the part. He wanted to play a Starfleet officer, not some crazy person.
I was going to be the one that they met when they got to San Francisco, and I was like, no, I want to beam up, be on the ship and all. So I didn't do it. They had me like talking jive to Spock.
He turned down the role and chose to make the Golden Child instead. Therefore, the Eddie Murphy role, the marine biologist part, and the female reporter were combined into one character. Years later, Eddie Murphy regretted turning down this role. Well, as filming date approached, Nimoy and Bennett were not 100% satisfied with the script. They called back an old friend, Nicholas Meyer, who wrote and directed Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and asked him for help. Bennett and Meyer decided to write the script together. Nicholas Meyer had already done a time travel story, Time After Time, that already took place in San Francisco, and he wanted the movie to take place somewhere else, like Paris, but Paramount refused. Nick Meyer rewrote the 1986 San Francisco scenes that involved much of the fish-out-of-water humor, while Harve Bennett rewrote the future Federation scenes on Vulcan, the probe threatening the Earth, and the final trial scene where Kirk is demoted back to captain. Within 20 days, they had a working script. Nicholas Meyer added much of the humor and social commentary that made it to the screen. They showed it to William Shatner, who offered his own notes, and this also required another round of rewrites. Bennett and Meyer were very careful to have Admiral Kirk be the undisputed leader of the group. Every event or action in this movie had to run through Kirk, who would make a command decision whether to proceed or not. For example, in the scene where Spock suspects the probe's message is the song of humpback whales, he tells Kirk immediately. Then when he has the idea to go into the past to get the whales, rather than suggest it himself, he puts the idea into Kirk's head, who ultimately makes the decision to go into time warp.
We could attempt to find some humpback whales.
You just said there aren't any, except on Earth of the past.
Yes, Doctor. That is exactly what I said.
Well, in that case... Now wait just a damn minute.
Spock, start your computations for time warp.
The entire movie is like this, where Kirk makes a decision for everything. Bennett and Meyer also decided to make the role of marine biologist Dr. Jillian Taylor be a woman in order to match the several predominant female marine biologists who were making news at the time. They also felt it would be interesting to have a female who was not a love interest to play against William Shatner. For the role of Dr. Jillian Taylor, they hired Catherine Hicks and renamed her character Jillian Taylor. Catherine Hicks was born in New York in 1951 and grew up in Scottsdale, Arizona. She attended St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana, and graduated with a degree in English literature. She won a prestigious acting fellowship to Cornell University, where she was a member of the Ithaca Repertory Theater Company, and she graduated Cornell with a Master of Fine Arts degree. Catherine Hicks landed her first major TV role as Dr. Faith Coolidge on the soap opera Ryan's Hope. She then starred in the Bad News Bears TV show, and in 1980, she nabbed the role of Marilyn Monroe in the ABC TV movie Marilyn the Untold Story, where she was nominated for an Emmy Award for Outstanding Lead Actress. She then played Bill Murray's fiancée in the 1984 film The Razor's Edge, and then starred in this movie, which would earn her a Saturn nomination. She would later go on to play the mother, Karen Barkley, in Child's Play, and then she would go on to an 11-year run as the mother on Seventh Heaven. Catherine Hicks is a practicing Roman Catholic, and every year since 1987, the University of Notre Dame gives out the Catherine Hicks Award to a graduating senior who demonstrates outstanding talent in theater. Now, in this movie, Catherine Hicks did an outstanding job. She fits in perfectly as a member of the Star Trek cast, and she's quirky and cute and has a charming innocence.
What is that?
What's wrong?
You have a pocket pager. Are you a doctor?
Plus, she has great chemistry with William Shatner.
What is it? I thought I told you never to call me.
Sorry, Admiral. We just thought you'd like to know. We're beaming them in now.
All right. Tell them phasers on stun. Good luck, Kirk out.
I think she was able to draw out a very funny and likable side of William Shatner that many had never seen before.
Who gets the bad news?
Don't tell me they don't use money in the 23rd century.
Well, we don't.
Now, Catherine Hicks was not a Star Trek fan and intentionally did not watch the Star Trek episodes because she felt that this would help her feel more like an outsider. 1 month before principal filming began, on January 28, 1986, the world saw the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger, which exploded 73 seconds after takeoff, and this movie was dedicated to the crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger. Star Trek IV began filming on February 1986, and most of the filming was done on location in San Francisco. And Leonard Nimoy intentionally chose sites that were famously associated with San Francisco, and this meant that the cast and crew got to be outside. This was the first film in 7 years that was not filmed inside a soundstage, and everyone involved had a great time shooting this movie. Leonard Nimoy would direct the film wearing his white robe and Vulcan ears, then step in front of the camera and act out a few scenes, then go back behind the camera and direct, all while wearing the white robe and Vulcan ears. Now, there was supposed to be a scene on Vulcan where Kirk asked Saavik, "Have you told him yet?" And Saavik would answer, "No, but I'm taking maternity leave from Starfleet." And this was a reference to the fact that Saavik was pregnant with Spock's child after their Pon farr encounter on planet Genesis. And this would explain why Saavik does not accompany the crew back to Earth, and would also explain why Saavik stays with Spock's mother on Vulcan. A powerful probe from far away comes to Earth looking for humpback whales. And the alien probe was designed by ILM, who brought in Ralph McQuarrie to help design the look of the probe. Ralph McQuarrie, the legendary artist who helped create the look of Star Wars. For the look of the probe, they envisioned a cross between a whale and the monolith from 2001, A Space Odyssey. In the original design, the shining spinning antenna was orange, but it ended up looking like a spinning basketball, so they changed it to the color blue. For the sound of the whales, sound editor Mark Mangini asked Leonard Nimoy what he imagined the probe sounding like, and Nimoy made a whoop 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 sound, so Mark Mangini took Leonard Nimoy into a sound studio and recorded him making the whoop 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 sound, and Mangini transformed it into the alien and foreign sounding voice of the probe. For the other ships in this movie, the USS Saratoga was the USS Reliant, and ILM still had the model of Space Dock in storage and just brought it out and used it for this movie. For the time-traveling scene, ILM wanted to create a segment that could showcase the development of CGI, just as the Genesis sequence introduced the world to CGI back in 1982. And this sequence wants to demonstrate CGI morphing technology, where one character morphs into the other. ILM had Ralph McQuarrie envision the sequence, and the team was aware of a company called Cyberware that had pioneered technology where a person could be scanned and a 3D model could be created from that scan, and then the images were morphed from one person to another. In 20th century San Francisco, the crew breaks up into teams to accomplish their individual tasks. Kirk and Spock attempt to locate some humpback whales. Uhura and Chekhov find a nuclear reactor to reconstitute the decaying dilithium crystals. And Bones and Scotty find plexiglass to create a tank to hold the whales, while Sulu finds a helicopter to transport the glass. Now, for the music, Leonard Nimoy wanted James Horner, who composed the music for Wrath of Khan and Search for Spock. However, Horner had other commitments and did not return. Nimoy went to his close friend, Leonard Rosenman, who had already earned 2 Academy Awards for Barry Lyndon and Bound for Glory. And rather than the epic music of Jerry Goldsmith or the intensity of James Horner, Rosenman decided to match the light tone of the movie. The music features a unique opening theme. Then we get a jazz number when the crew explores the streets of San Francisco, a Russian theme when Chekhov outruns the security guards on the Enterprise, and a comedic medley at the hospital where our crew spring Chekhov. After screening the movie to Paramount executives, Paramount sent Harve Bennett a suggestion to have on-screen subtitles translating what the probe was saying, and even recommended that the probe ask, "Where are you?" Leonard Nimoy and Nicholas Meyer were able to push back to the Paramount executives, insisting that including subtitles would ruin the sense of mystery. And eventually the Paramount executives gave in. One of my favorite scenes in the film is where Spock Vulcan nerve pinches an obnoxious punk rocker. And Leonard Nimoy said that this scene was inspired by a real-life incident where Leonard Nimoy was in New York and waiting at a bus stop when he encountered a young punk with a loud stereo who was blasting it so loud that he was annoying everyone on the street. And Leonard vividly remembered thinking to himself, if I were Spock, I'd just nerve pinch the hell out of that guy. And so Nimoy actually got to do it years later in this movie. However, the earlier writers of the first version of the script have claimed that this scene was actually in the first draft of the script, but it took place on a subway rather than a bus. Regardless, the true hero of the scene is Leonard Nimoy's assistant, Kirk Thatcher, who played the part of the punk rocker, and even shaved his own head, got a mohawk, dyed it orange, and bought his own punk clothes. Kirk Thatcher used to be in a band as a teenager, and he wrote the song, I Hate You. Now originally, Paramount had gotten the license from several new age rock bands like Duran Duran, but Kirk Thatcher told Nimoy, that's not punk, I can write you a punk song and it'll cost you nothing. So he wrote the lyrics and had sound editor Mark Mangini come up with a simple guitar riff, and Kirk Thatcher performed and recorded the song over the weekend and gave the vocals an English accent to evoke the Sex Pistols. To this day, Kirk Thatcher gets requests from modern-day bands requesting to cover I Hate You. He even came up with the idea to have his unconscious head turn off the stereo. Kirk Thatcher also provided the voice of the computer that quizzes Spock at the beginning of the movie, but the voice was played at high speed. Kirk Thatcher was an ILM employee who was on the team that worked on the ear critter in The Wrath of Khan, and he applied for and got the job as Leonard Nimoy's assistant in this film. And Kirk Thatcher was a die-hard Star Trek fan and was blown away to be working with his idol. Kirk Thatcher was so dedicated and worked so hard on this film that he was promoted to associate producer. And to this day, he is still a working director in Hollywood. He wrote the screenplay for The Muppets Treasure Island and directed 2 Muppet movies, The Muppets Wizard of Oz and The Muppets Christmas Special. And he also produces and directs a kids' TV show called Sid the Science Kid. And in 2022, he played the monster hunter Joe Vaughn in the Marvel show Werewolf by Night. And this is cool. He and Leonard Nimoy remained friends for decades until Nimoy's death in 2015. Kirk Thatcher recalls memories of the Voyage Home, and after a day of shooting, the two would retire to Nimoy's office, and Nimoy would pour himself a large gin and tonic, and the two would chat about life and the future. Another fan-favorite scene is where Chekhov and Uhura are on a busy San Francisco street trying to find directions to the naval base in Alameda, where they keep the nuclear vessels. Much of the scene was improvised with extras passing by ignoring our crew. However, one of the bystanders actually answers,
Ooh, I don't know if I know the answer to that. I think it's across the bay, in Alameda.
And Chekhov says in an exhausting and defeated tone,
That's what I said, Alameda, I know that.
But where is Alameda?
This was accidentally improvised when the extra, who was hired as a non-speaking part, accidentally answered Chekhov. And Leonard Nimoy loved the spontaneity and kept the interaction in the final cut. And her story is actually hilarious. Her name is Leila Saracallo, and she was not an actor, but a random pedestrian whose car was towed due to the city clearing cars for this scene. And they offered her a non-speaking part, and she accepted so she could make money and pay for the towing ticket. When we see the shot of the police officer, that was apparently not an extra, but a real San Francisco police officer who was there for crowd control. Now when Uhura and Chekhov find the nuclear vessels,
And Admiral, it is the Enterprise.
And Nimoy had originally wanted to use the real Enterprise, but the ship was out at sea on a mission, and therefore they used the USS Ranger. Now most of the scenes of the whales were actually 4-foot-long animatronic puppets. Nimoy decided to splurge on these puppets, and he spent $1 million, and ILM hired professional marine biologist Peter Fulkins as a consultant in order to get the whales' look and movements to be accurate. The models of George and Gracie were operated by remote control with men outside the tank. and they were so realistic that the U.S. Fishing Authority initially criticized the movie for getting too close to the whales during filming. And they were surprised that these whales were not real, but were robot puppets filmed on a Paramount set. Leonard Nimoy was sad that ILM was not nominated for an Academy Award for the creation of the whales, nor did they receive much recognition despite the brilliance of these robots. And Leonard Nimoy suspected that this was because the animatronic whales looked so good and so convincing that most people, including the Academy, just accepted that they were real whales and had no idea that these were robots created by ILM. And for years after the movie, the animatronic whales toured the country on display for children at museums and multiple aquariums. The final scene where the bird of prey crashes in the San Francisco Bay was filmed on a Paramount lot pool. Leonard Nimoy and his crew used the lot pool, which was being used as a parking lot, and the pool was known as Blue Sky Tank and often referred to as the B Tank, and it had been used for the parting of the Red Sea in the film 10 Commandments and for the TV movie Return to Gilligan's Island. And in 1979, the lot was used without water to film the Vulcan scene in Star Trek The Motion Picture. The pool had not been used in decades and no one knew how to use the water pump, so Paramount had to call an old technician who had already retired to come in and teach everyone how to operate the pump. 1 million gallons of water was filtered and sterilized and put into the pool, and the water was 3 feet deep. And the scene where Admiral Kirk swims around the bird of prey was actually done by William Shatner, who did all the swimming by himself. And a full-size humpback whale tail was built and operated so it could be slammed in front of the Star Trek crew. And the staff of Paramount would come to the Blue Sky Tank during lunch and enjoy the giant swimming pool and dip their feet in the water while eating their lunch. And you want to know something cool? This building here is the Gene Roddenberry building, which was dedicated to him in 1991, months before his death. Now here's a bit of trivia. Everyone knows one of the most famous lines in Star Trek is, "Beam me up, Scotty." And yet Kirk never said this in the TV series. And well, he says it here.
Scotty, beam me up.
And this is the first time in Star Trek history where Kirk actually says these lines. But hold on a minute. Many fans will point out that he technically says,
Scotty, beam me up.
So technically, "Beam me up, Scotty" has yet to be said on screen by William Shatner. At the end of the film, Captain Kirk and his team are assigned to a newly built Enterprise. However, they had damaged the model in the last two movies, and therefore the production team wanted to build a brand new redesign of the Enterprise they could use for subsequent sequels to this movie. However, Leonard Nimoy chose to save money and had the production team fix the original Enterprise, and the team spent 6 weeks fixing it and painting the old model, and it looks fantastic. And once again, Leonard Nimoy delivered the film on time and under budget, and the film was actually made on the ultra-low budget of only $21 million, which was even $1 million less than the original projected budget of $22 million. Upon its release, it was a huge critical and box office success, making $39.6 million in its first week and grossing over $133 million overall. And this film was also a huge critical success and received universal critical acclaim. This movie also had what is known as breakout appeal, because many people who are not Star Trek fans came out to watch this movie, and many of them were converted into Trekkies. The success of this movie was instrumental in getting Roddenberry's second live-action Star Trek series on television, because 1 year later, the world saw the release of Star Trek The Next Generation, which was actually already being taped during the filming of Star Trek IV. When this movie was being released outside the US, it was released under the title The Voyage Home, with Star Trek being removed from the title. And this is because in 1986, Star Trek was not as famous outside the US. And it was a gamble that paid off because The Voyage Home was massively popular outside the US. The Voyage Home was the first Star Trek film to be shown in the Soviet Union and was screened by the World Wildlife Fund on June 26, 1987 in Moscow. And this was to celebrate the banning of whaling. Both Leonard Nimoy and Harve Bennett attended the screening, and they were pleased to see the Russians absolutely loving the movie. And when McCoy says,
The bureaucratic mentality is the only constant in the universe,
the Russian audience broke out in applause. And Star Trek was hot, and 1986 would mark the start of the second golden age of Star Trek, a massively successful film. 2 more movies to follow. The Next Generation TV series, followed by a second TV show, Deep Space Nine, and then a third show called Voyager. Furthermore, this film actually brought attention to the plight of the whales who were on the brink of extinction. Greenpeace saw a huge uptick in donations following the release of this movie, and saw huge increases in the interest in the plight of whales, as well as an increase in activism and volunteers who help preserve sea life. This resulted in a decrease of whale hunting throughout the 80s and 90s as the world saw a huge increase in whale watching tourism, which became a multi-billion-dollar industry, dwarfing the whale hunting industry. And in 2016, 30 years after the release of this movie, the humpback whale was removed from the endangered species list. So it looks like Leonard Nimoy may have actually saved the whales after all. With the success of Star Trek IV, a sequel was immediately greenlit. Shatner and Nimoy had a favored nation's contract, and whatever one was offered, the other had to be given the same deal, so Paramount had to let William Shatner direct the next movie. And we'll talk about that movie in our next episode.